If someone told me a piece of silk could unravel your entire life, I'd have laughed. No, not just laughed, belly laughed, the kind that makes your ribs ache and people across the room think you're unhinged. But here I was, standing in my dimly lit studio, holding a silk scarf that didn't belong to me or, supposedly, my wife, Eliza. The scarf was exquisite, deep crimson with gold embroidery, the kind of thing that makes you think of opulence and whispered secrets. It reeked of wealth and, annoyingly, perfume that was decidedly not Eliza's usual subtle lavender. I held it up like some amateur detective inspecting a murder weapon, my thoughts racing faster than I could paint. "Eliza?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady, though inside I was about 3 seconds from unraveling. She appeared in the doorway, the picture of elegance, wearing one of those flowy dresses that look effortless but probably cost more than I make in a month of painting. Her hair was tied up in a way that said, "I don't try too hard, but I'm perfect anyway." And those eyes, hazel and unreadable, met mine without a flicker of guilt. "Yes, darling," she asked, her tone light, almost amused, as if I'd called her to discuss what to have for dinner, not a potential marital catastrophe. "Is this yours?" I held up the scarf. My tone was calm, measured, like I wasn't screaming inside. She tilted her head, a soft smile curling her lips. "No, it's lovely, though. Is it a new prop for your work?" "Prop? Prop?" Was she serious? I cleared my throat. "No, it was on the table here. Just, lying around." Her eyes flickered to the scarf for the briefest moment before she shrugged. "Must be from one of your patrons. They're always leaving things behind." "Patrons?" "Right. Because my clientele consisted entirely of eccentric aristocrats who threw silk scarves around like confetti." "Must be," I murmured, though the knot in my stomach said otherwise. She stepped closer, placing a hand on my arm. It was a soft, delicate touch, the kind that used to make me feel like the luckiest man alive. Now, it felt calculated. "You've been working too hard, Anton," she said, her voice soothing. "You always get this way when you're deep in your art. Don't let little things distract you." Little things. The scarf, the perfume, her new wardrobe that I definitely hadn't paid for. Just little things. As she turned and glided out of the studio, I stood there, clutching the scarf like it was Pandora's box. My gut told me the answers I didn't want to find were wrapped up in that silk. And then there was him. Sebastian. Or, as I'd taken to calling him in my head, Lord Smugface. Our esteemed patron, self-appointed savior of starving artists, and, apparently, a connoisseur of everything I held dear, including, perhaps, my wife. I leaned against the edge of my work table, staring at the half-finished portrait of Eliza on the easel. Her eyes in the painting seemed to mock me now, their warmth replaced by something distant. Had I painted what I wanted to see? Or what I feared? The scarf slipped from my hand, pooling on the floor like spilled wine. Little things, I thought. It's always the little things that destroy you. Sebastian arrived at our house the next evening, unannounced, as usual. The man had the kind of confidence that made you want to trip him, just to see if he could fall gracefully. Spoiler alert, he probably could. He waltzed in, all tailored suits and cologne that probably cost more than my annual paint supply budget. His perfectly polished shoes clicked against the wooden floor as he extended his arms, like a benevolent emperor descending to bless us mere mortals. "Anton. Eliza. What a delight to find you both home," he said, his smile revealing teeth so perfect they looked like they'd been sculpted by Michelangelo himself. I glanced at Eliza, who was standing by the fireplace, her cheeks tinged with a blush I hadn't seen in years. It hit me like a sucker punch. She didn't blush for me anymore. "Sebastian," I said, plastering on a smile that probably looked more like a grimace. "To what do we owe the pleasure?" He placed a hand over his chest, mock offended. Must I always have a reason to visit my favorite artist and his charming wife? Yes. Yes, you must. "Well, it's always nice to see you," Eliza chimed in, her voice softer than usual, like she was trying not to wake a sleeping child. Or maybe a sleeping husband. Sebastian turned his attention to her, his eyes lighting up in a way that made me grip the back of the nearest chair. And you, my dear Eliza, look radiant tonight. That dress is divine. Oh, this old thing? She laughed lightly, brushing invisible lint off her shoulder. It was not an old thing. I'd never seen that dress before in my life. I have a proposition, Sebastian announced, turning his attention back to me, though his gaze kept darting to Eliza like she was the main attraction and I was just the opening act. A dinner party. This Friday. My estate. I've invited a few collectors, people who could truly elevate your work to its deserved recognition. A dinner party at Sebastian's estate. Fantastic. Nothing like being surrounded by his high society friends who'd probably refer to me as that scruffy genius while sipping champagne that cost more than my rent. That's generous of you, I said, trying to match his smooth tone and failing miserably. But I'm not sure if... Eliza interrupted, her eyes bright. Oh, Anton, we should go. It sounds wonderful. Wonderful? Spending an evening watching Sebastian flirt with my wife while I pretend to be grateful for his patronage sounded about as wonderful as a root canal. But her excitement made it impossible to refuse. So, I nodded, resigned. All right, we'll be there. Sebastian clapped his hands together. Marvelous. I'll have the car sent for you both. The car. Of course. Because arriving in my paint-streaked truck wouldn't do for his glittering soiree. As he left, he turned back at the door, fixing me with a smile that somehow felt more like a warning. Oh, and Anton, wear something formal. The evening deserves a touch of elegance. He winked at Eliza before disappearing into the night. I stood in the doorway for a moment, staring into the darkness where his car had been. My fists clenched at my sides. Eliza touched my arm, her voice gentle. He's just trying to help, Anton. You know how much he admires your work. Admired my work. Right. That's what this was about. I looked at her, searching her face for some sign that she could see through him, through the charade. But her expression was serene, almost dreamlike. And for the first time, I wondered if maybe she didn't want to see. The scarf was still lying in my studio, coiled on the floor like a serpent. It wasn't mine. It wasn't hers. But it was his. And I was starting to think he'd left it there on purpose. Sebastian's estate was exactly what you'd expect from a man who owned silk scarves with monograms and casually invested in artists like me. It was sprawling, decadent, and intimidatingly perfect. Marble floors gleamed under chandeliers the size of small cars. The walls were adorned with art, real art, not the kind of knockoffs you'd find in a dentist's office. We arrived in a sleek black car that smelled like leather and money, sent, of course, by our illustrious host. I stepped out, adjusting my ill-fitting suit, feeling like a street musician who'd somehow stumbled into the Royal Opera House. Eliza, on the other hand, looked flawless, her emerald green dress hugging her figure in a way that made me simultaneously proud and insecure. Sebastian was waiting for us at the entrance, flanked by two waiters carrying silver trays of champagne. Ah, there they are, he exclaimed, arms wide as if we were a long-lost family. Sebastian, I said, forcing a polite smile. Quite the place you've got here. He grinned, his teeth practically sparkling in the soft light. Anton, this is nothing compared to the brilliance of your work. Tonight, it's all about you. Of course it is, I muttered under my breath, but he didn't seem to hear. Eliza stepped forward, her hand briefly grazing Sebastian's arm. This is incredible, Sebastian. Thank you for including us. His gaze lingered on her a fraction too long before he smiled. The pleasure is entirely mine, Eliza. It took every ounce of self-control not to roll my eyes. The evening unfolded like a scene from one of those over-the-top period dramas Eliza loved. Waiters floated through the room with trays of caviar and champagne, while an impeccably dressed string quartet played softly in the background. Sebastian, ever the charming host, drifted from guest to guest, his laughter echoing through the grand hall. Eliza was radiant, effortlessly navigating the crowd as if she'd been born into this world. She laughed at their jokes, accepted their compliments with grace, and even engaged in an animated conversation about art trends in Paris. I, meanwhile, stood awkwardly by the buffet, trying to figure out how to pronounce half the dishes. Then came the moment I'd been dreading. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sebastian announced, tapping his glass to silence the room. "I'd like to take a moment to honor a truly remarkable talent." My stomach sank. "Anton," he continued, gesturing for me to step forward, "is not just a painter. He is a visionary. A man who sees the world in ways the rest of us can only dream of." The applause was polite, but I couldn't help noticing how many people glanced at Eliza instead of me. Sebastian wasn't done. "And, of course, every great artist has a muse. Eliza, my dear, your beauty and grace clearly inspire Anton's genius." There it was. The comment that made me want to chuck my champagne flute at his head. Eliza blushed, looking down shyly, and Sebastian's smile widened. "Would you all care to see his latest work?" he asked, beckoning the guests to follow him into another room. I froze. What latest work? I hadn't even finished anything recently. Sebastian led us into a smaller, dimly lit gallery. At the center of the room, draped in velvet, was a painting. My painting. The room fell silent as Sebastian pulled back the covering, revealing a portrait of Eliza, unfinished but unmistakably hers. Her expression was serene, almost angelic, but there was a coldness in her eyes, one I hadn't consciously painted. The crowd murmured appreciatively, but my gaze darted to Eliza. She looked stunned. Not flattered, not angry. Just frozen. "How did you get this?" I asked, my voice low and sharp. Sebastian clapped a hand on my shoulder, his grin infuriatingly smug. "You must have forgotten, my friend. You left it at the gallery the other week, and I thought it deserved a proper unveiling." I hadn't left it anywhere. Eliza's hand trembled as she reached for my arm. "Anton, you didn't mention you'd started another portrait." I couldn't answer. My mind was racing. Sebastian had stolen the painting. No, worse, he'd planned this. "Exquisite, isn't it?" Sebastian said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "The eyes, they're haunting." I looked at him, and for the first time, I saw it clearly, the manipulation, the game. He wasn't just interested in Eliza. He wanted to own us both. And I wasn't about to let that happen. The room hummed with muted conversation as guests admired the portrait, their comments blending into a soft, insistent buzz. Eliza lingered near the painting, her fingers lightly brushing her necklace, a nervous habit she'd developed over the years. I stood frozen, the knot in my stomach tightening as Sebastian basked in the glow of his audience. I made my way toward him, my steps deliberate, my jaw clenched. He was standing near a trio of socialites, charming them with anecdotes I was certain were entirely fabricated. "Sebastian," I said, cutting into his monologue, a word. He glanced at me, his expression one of feigned surprise. "Of course, Anton." "Excuse me, ladies." I led him into a quieter corner of the gallery, far from prying eyes and ears. Turning to face him, I kept my voice low but firm. "How did you get that painting?" "I didn't leave it anywhere, and you know it." Sebastian smiled, the kind of smile that made you want to punch it off his face. "Ah, the artist's passion. It's admirable, Anton, truly. But you're mistaken. The gallery delivered it to me last week." "Don't lie to me," I hissed. "That painting wasn't finished." "You had no right." "I had every right," he interrupted smoothly, his voice like silk. "You're under my patronage, remember? I simply thought the world deserved to see your brilliance." I took a step closer, glaring at him. "This isn't about my brilliance, and we both know it." For the briefest moment, something flickered in his eyes, amusement, maybe, or satisfaction. "You're right," he said softly. "It's about her." The words hit me like a blow. I stared at him, struggling to maintain my composure. Stay away from my wife. Sebastian's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. Your wife, Anton. Is she really yours? Or is she just playing the role you've written for her, the dutiful muse, the perfect subject? I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. You have no idea what you're talking about. Oh, but I do, he said, stepping closer. His voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. Eliza is extraordinary. She deserves more than a life in the shadows of your canvases. She deserves to be adored, cherished, by someone who truly sees her. My blood boiled. You think you see her? You think buying her gifts and throwing parties makes you the hero in this story? She's my wife, Sebastian. And I'll be damned if I let you. Anton. The voice was soft, almost hesitant. I turned to see Eliza standing a few feet away, her expression unreadable. How long have you been standing there? I asked, my voice cracking slightly. Long enough, she said quietly. Her gaze shifted between me and Sebastian, and for the first time, I couldn't tell what she was thinking. Sebastian, of course, didn't miss a beat. Eliza, my dear. I was just telling Anton how breathtaking your portrait is. It's a testament to his genius. She smiled faintly, but her eyes remained distant. It's beautiful, Anton. Truly. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to reach out, to close the space between us, but something in her posture stopped me. Sebastian placed a hand lightly on her arm. Shall we rejoin the others? I believe the champagne is calling. She hesitated, just for a moment, before nodding. Of course. As they walked away, I stood rooted to the spot, my chest tight with anger and something else, something far more dangerous. Doubt. The evening dragged on, every smile and laugh from Eliza feeling like a dagger to my gut. I told myself it was all an act, that she was simply being polite, but the small, private moments between her and Sebastian told another story. A lingering glance here, a soft laugh there, it was subtle, almost imperceptible. But I saw it. As the night wore on, I found myself wandering back to the portrait. It loomed in the center of the room, a silent reminder of everything that was slipping through my fingers. Remarkable, isn't it? The voice startled me. I turned to see an older woman, elegantly dressed, studying the painting with keen eyes. Remarkable how? I asked cautiously. She tilted her head, a wry smile tugging at her lips. The eyes. They tell a story. Not of love, but of something more complex. Fear, perhaps. Or guilt. I stared at her, my throat tightening. Guilt? She nodded. Oh, yes. The kind of guilt that comes from wanting two things at once. It's all there, plain as day, if you know how to look. I turned back to the portrait, my heart pounding. For the first time, I realized the older woman was right. The eyes in the painting weren't just cold. They were conflicted. And I had no idea what story they were telling. The ride home from Sebastian's estate was suffocating, the silence in the car stretching like a taut wire. Eliza stared out the window, her reflection in the glass looking as distant as I felt. I had questions, too many to count, but every time I opened my mouth, the words lodged in my throat like a stone. She finally broke the silence as we pulled into the driveway. You didn't have to cause a scene, Anton. A scene? I scoffed, turning to face her. Do you think that's what tonight was about? A scene? She sighed, her hand lingering on the door handle, as if debating whether to stay or leave. Sebastian was trying to help you, Anton. He's given you opportunities no one else would. Oh, he's given me plenty, I snapped. Opportunities, champagne, stolen paintings. What more could I possibly ask for? Her gaze hardened. You're being paranoid. Am I? I stepped out of the car, slamming the door behind me. Because it seems to me that every time Sebastian helps, he takes something that doesn't belong to him. Eliza followed me into the house, her voice sharp now. What is that supposed to mean? I spun around, my frustration boiling over. It means that man has been circling you like a vulture, and you don't even see it. Or worse, you do, and you're letting it happen. Her eyes flashed with anger. That's unfair. Is it? I countered, stepping closer. Then tell me why he had that painting. Tell me why he looks at you like you're his. Tell me why. I stopped, mid-sentence, as something caught my eye. The scarf. It was still lying on the studio floor, where I'd left it days ago. Crimson silk, embroidered with gold, taunting me like an unspoken accusation. What? Eliza asked, her voice softer now. I pointed to the scarf. That. You told me you didn't recognize it, but it's his, isn't it? She glanced at it, her expression unreadable. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't, I said, my voice trembling. Don't lie to me, Eliza. Not about this. Her shoulders stiffened, and for a moment, I thought she might deny it again. But then, she sighed, her fingers brushing her temple as if she could rub away the tension. Yes, she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. It's his. He left it here by accident. I felt like the ground had shifted beneath me. When? A few weeks ago, she said. He came by to discuss your work. He must have forgotten it. Discuss my work? I repeated, laughing bitterly. Is that what they're calling it now? She flinched at the venom in my tone but didn't look away. It's not what you think, Anton. No? I took a step closer, the scarf now clutched in my hand. Because what I think is that Sebastian's been playing a very long game, and you've been letting him win. Her jaw tightened, and for a moment, the Eliza I knew, the confident, graceful Eliza, looked vulnerable. You've been so consumed with your art, Anton. So distant. Do you even realize how lonely it's been? The words stung more than I wanted to admit. So that's your excuse? I've been working too much, so you decided to let him waltz in and take what he wants? Her voice rose, matching my anger. You don't see me, Anton. Not really. You see your muse, your inspiration. But me? The woman standing in front of you? You haven't seen her in years. The weight of her words hit me hard, but I refused to let them settle. And Sebastian sees you, does he? She didn't answer. The silence was worse than anything she could have said. I turned away, the scarf crumpling in my fist. This stops now, Eliza. Him, his games, everything. You make a choice. Right here, right now. She didn't respond, and when I turned back, I saw tears glistening in her eyes. Anton, she whispered, her voice trembling, it's not that simple. My chest tightened. It is. It's him or me. For a moment, she just stood there, her lips parted as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Finally, she shook her head, stepping past me toward the stairs. I need time, she said quietly, her voice breaking. Time. As she disappeared upstairs, I stood alone in the studio, the scarf still in my hand. Time, she said. But time was the one thing I wasn't sure we had left. The next morning, the silence in the house was deafening. Eliza was in the garden, quietly tending to the roses as though last night's argument hadn't happened. I watched her from the window of my studio, her movements calm, precise. I couldn't tell if she was lost in thought or deliberately avoiding me. I couldn't bear it. I needed answers, clarity, anything to stop the storm raging in my mind. And if she wouldn't give them to me, I'd find them myself. I started searching the house. Not for anything specific, just something. Anything that might confirm or dispel the nagging suspicions clawing at me. Drawers, shelves, cabinets, I went through them all with a mix of desperation and guilt. And then I remembered the attic. The attic was Eliza's space, filled with her keepsakes, old photographs, and things she deemed too sentimental to throw away. I hadn't been up there in years. The air was thick with dust, the wooden floor creaking under my weight as I climbed the narrow ladder. The sunlight streamed through a small, round window, casting a golden glow over the cluttered room. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just boxes labeled with her elegant handwriting, childhood, travel, memories. But then, tucked under a stack of old books, I found a small wooden chest. It wasn't locked, but it felt heavy with significance. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid. Inside were letters, dozens of them, tied neatly with a crimson ribbon. My heart sank as I recognized the handwriting on the envelopes. Sebastian's. I sat down on the floor, the chest open in front of me, my pulse hammering in my ears. The first letter I picked up was dated 2 years ago, long before Sebastian had ever stepped into our lives as my patron. I unfolded it carefully, my eyes scanning the lines with growing disbelief. My dearest Eliza. You'll never know how often I think of you. How your laughter lingers in my mind like the sweetest melody. I told myself I wouldn't write, that I'd let you go, but it's impossible. You haunt me, Eliza. You always have. The letter slipped from my hands. Always? I reached for another, my breath catching in my throat as I read. I've tried to forget you. God knows I've tried. But every time I see another painting of Anton's, I see you. You're there in every stroke, every line. Does he know, I wonder? Does he see you the way I do? My vision blurred as the pieces of the puzzle began to click into place. This wasn't new. Sebastian's obsession with Eliza wasn't some recent development. It had been festering for years, hidden beneath his charm and patronage. And Eliza, she'd kept this from me. I sifted through the rest of the letters, each one a painful confirmation of what I'd feared, that Sebastian had never been interested in my art. He'd been interested in her, and I was merely a convenient excuse to stay close. The last letter I read was the most damning of all. Eliza. You've always belonged to me, even if you can't admit it. But one day, you will. One day, you'll see that what we have is inevitable. I shoved the letters back into the chest, slamming the lid shut. My hands were shaking, my chest tight with anger, betrayal, and something I couldn't quite name. I climbed back down the ladder, the chest tucked under my arm. Eliza was still in the garden, her back to me, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside. Care to explain these? I said, my voice cutting through the quiet like a knife. She turned, her face pale when she saw the chest. Anton, where do you think? I snapped, setting it down between us. You kept this from me? You let him write to you, let him think he had some claim over you? It's not what you think, she said quickly, stepping closer. Those letters, they were from before. Before what? I interrupted, my voice rising. Before he started coming to our house? Before he started flirting with you right in front of me? Or before you started blushing every time he looked at you? She flinched, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. I never encouraged him, Anton. I never wrote back. Then why keep them? I demanded. Why not burn them, throw them away? Why hide them in the attic like some secret treasure? Tears welled up in her eyes, but I was too furious to care. I didn't know how to tell you, she said, her voice breaking. I didn't want to hurt you. Hurt me? I laughed bitterly. You've done a bang-up job of that anyway, haven't you? For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. I should have told you, she whispered finally, her voice trembling. I should have destroyed them. But I didn't because part of me was afraid. Afraid of what? She hesitated, and when she finally spoke, her words shattered me. Afraid that if I let go of them, I'd lose the part of myself that wasn't just yours. I stared at her, the weight of her confession sinking in. And for the first time, I realized this wasn't just about Sebastian. This was about us. And we were standing on the edge of a cliff, teetering dangerously close to the abyss. The house was a war zone of silence. Days had passed since the discovery of the letters, and Eliza and I were like strangers occupying the same space. The air between us felt fragile, like it might shatter with a single word. I buried myself in my studio, attacking the canvas with furious strokes, but the work wasn't coming together. Every line was too harsh, every color too loud. My frustration bled into the painting until it became a chaotic mess of anger and confusion. I wasn't painting Eliza anymore. I was painting what she'd become to me, an enigma I couldn't solve, a puzzle missing too many pieces. Then, as if summoned by my thoughts, she appeared in the doorway. "Anton," she said softly. I kept my back to her, my brush still moving. "What is it, Eliza? We need to talk." I snorted, a bitter sound that even surprised me. "Talk? Now you want to talk?" She hesitated, but then stepped inside, her voice firmer. "Yes. We can't keep doing this." I set down the brush, turning to face her. "Doing what, exactly? Pretending everything's fine? Ignoring the fact that our marriage has become a goddamn chess game with Sebastian as the puppet master?" Her jaw tightened, but she didn't look away. "You think this is all my fault, don't you? Isn't it?" I shot back. "You let him into our lives. You let him get close to you. And now he thinks he owns you, Eliza. He thinks he owns us." "That's not fair," she said, her voice rising. "I didn't ask for his attention, Anton. And I didn't ask for you to treat me like some prized possession you're afraid of losing." The words stung more than I wanted to admit. "Prized possession?" I said, laughing bitterly. "Is that how you see yourself? Because that's not how I see you, Eliza. But maybe that's how he sees you, a trophy to add to his collection." Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, she looked like she might slap me. But then, she drew a deep breath, steadying herself. "You've been blind, Anton. Blind to how distant you've become. Blind to how much I've needed you. And blind to the fact that Sebastian isn't the root of our problems. We are." The words hung in the air, cutting through my anger like a blade. "What's that supposed to mean?" I demanded, though deep down, I already knew. "It means you stopped seeing me years ago," she said, her voice breaking. "You stopped caring about who I was, what I wanted. You buried yourself in your art, and I got lost." I stared at her, my chest tightening. "And what? He found you?" "No," she said firmly. "I found myself. Or at least, I started to. But every time I thought about leaving, I stayed because I still love you, Anton. Even when it hurts. Even when it feels like I'm invisible to you." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. She took a step closer, her voice softening. "Do you even know what it's like to feel forgotten in your own marriage? To feel like a ghost in your own home?" Her words hit me harder than I expected. I thought back to all the nights I'd spent in the studio, oblivious to the fact that she'd been downstairs, waiting for me to come back to her. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She laughed bitterly, shaking her head. "I did. In 100 little ways. But you weren't listening." The weight of her confession pressed down on me, suffocating. But before I could say anything, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the moment. We both turned toward the window, and my stomach dropped when I saw who it was. "Sebastian. What the hell is he doing here?" I muttered, already heading for the door. Eliza grabbed my arm. "Anton, don't. Please. Don't." I snapped, pulling away. "He's been circling us like a vulture, and now he's here, on my property? No, Eliza. This ends now." I stormed outside, my anger boiling over as Sebastian stepped out of his sleek black car. He looked as calm and collected as ever, as though this was just another casual visit. "Sebastian," I said coldly. "You've got some nerve showing up here." He smiled, the picture of infuriating confidence. "Anton, my friend. I thought it was time we had a little chat." "We have nothing to chat about," I growled. He tilted his head, his smile never faltering. "I think we do. You see, I've been patient, giving you time to see reason. But it seems you're intent on making things difficult." "Get to the point," I snapped. Sebastian stepped closer, his voice lowering. The point, Anton, is that you've been holding her back. Eliza deserves more than this, more than a life in the shadows of your easel. I clenched my fists, my vision narrowing. If you think for 1 second. Enough. Eliza's voice cut through the tension like a whip. She stepped between us, her face pale but determined. This stops now, she said, looking from me to Sebastian. Both of you. I'm not some prize to be fought over. I'm a person, and I'm making my own decisions. Her words silenced us both. She turned to Sebastian, her voice firm. You need to leave. His expression faltered, just for a moment, but he recovered quickly, nodding. If that's what you want. It is, she said, her voice steady. Sebastian gave her a long, searching look before getting back into his car. Goodbye, Eliza, he said softly. As his car disappeared down the driveway, I turned to Eliza, my heart pounding. What now? I asked. She met my gaze, her eyes filled with tears. Now, Anton, we figure out if there's anything left to save. The days that followed Sebastian's departure were heavy with silence. Not the suffocating kind that filled the house after an argument, but something deeper. Final. It was the silence of two people standing on opposite sides of a canyon, unsure if they could ever bridge the gap between them. Eliza kept herself busy, her movements purposeful but distant. She spent hours in the garden, pruning, planting, and avoiding me. I buried myself in the studio, staring at blank canvases that refused to speak to me. The letters were gone. I burned them in the fireplace one night while Eliza was asleep. Watching the flames consume them should have felt cathartic, but instead, it left an ache in my chest, as if I'd destroyed something far greater than paper. A week later, I found her in the garden again, crouched by the roses. Her hands were streaked with dirt, but her face was clean, devoid of the usual carefully applied makeup. She looked up when she heard my footsteps, and for the first time in days, our eyes met. We can't keep doing this, I said, breaking the fragile silence. She straightened, brushing her hands against her skirt. Doing what? This, limbo. Avoiding each other. Pretending like we're fine when we're clearly not. She sighed, her gaze dropping to the flowers. What do you want me to say, Anton? That I'm sorry? That I wish none of this had happened? I stepped closer, my voice softening. I want the truth, Eliza. That's all I've ever wanted. She looked at me, her hazel eyes shimmering with unshed tears. The truth is, I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know who we are. And I don't know if I can fix this. Her words cut through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. Neither do I. But I'm willing to try if you are. For a moment, she just stared at me, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek. Okay. We didn't say anything more. We didn't need to. The next day, I decided to start over. The unfinished portrait of Eliza sat in the center of the studio, haunting me with its cold, conflicted eyes. I stared at it for hours, trying to find the woman I loved in those strokes of paint, but she wasn't there. So I painted over it. Layer by layer, I erased the Eliza I thought I knew and started painting the one who stood before me now, flawed, beautiful, and utterly human. I didn't try to idealize her or capture some grand, unattainable essence. I painted the small things, the way her hair curled at the nape of her neck, the softness of her hands, the faint lines around her eyes from years of laughter and tears. By the time I finished, it was late. I stepped back, my heart pounding as I studied the work. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Eliza found me there, standing in the glow of the dim studio light. She stepped inside, her gaze falling on the canvas. Her breath caught, and for a moment, I thought she might cry. That's me, she whispered. I nodded. It's you. She moved closer, her fingers brushing the edge of the frame. It's beautiful, Anton. It's honest, I said. We stood there in silence, the weight of the past few weeks hanging between us. Finally, she turned to me, her voice trembling. "Do you think we can be honest with each other from now on?" I hesitated, then took her hand. "I think we have to be. It's the only way we have a chance." She nodded, her grip tightening around mine. The next morning, I found the scarf. It was tucked away in a drawer in the studio, forgotten amidst the chaos of everything else. I stared at it for a long moment before picking it up and carrying it outside. Eliza was in the garden again, her back to me as she watered the roses. When she turned and saw me holding the scarf, her expression softened. "What are you going to do with it?" she asked. I looked at the crimson silk, its gold embroidery catching the sunlight. Then I walked to the edge of the property, where the stream cut through the woods, and tossed it into the water. The scarf floated for a moment before sinking, the current carrying it away. When I turned back, Eliza was watching me, a small, uncertain smile on her lips. "Goodbye, Sebastian," I said quietly. She stepped closer, sliding her hand into mine. For the first time in what felt like forever, the touch felt real. We stood there together, watching the water flow. The future was uncertain, but for now, it was enough. Because sometimes, the only way to move forward is to let go. Subscribe to never miss a new story and discover even more captivating tales.